I think that we need to use capitalism for all of its advantages. It gives incentives for people to do their best, and that's why it's at the base of every successful economy. But we need to pay attention to some of the flaws in the way we measure what's good and what's bad, what's progress and what's the lack of progress. For example, pollution is not included in the measurements of economic growth and progress, and so we get more of it, and we should bring that into the system of accounts. We should also adopt a longer-term horizon so that we just don't satisfy ourselves with these very short-term quarterly report type measurements, because real progress requires investing for progress over time.
Well, Asia is, of course, an extraordinarily important economic environment today, and will, in the next series of decades, in the next centuries, become even more important. And so Asia has the potential to fundamentally change how business is done. It could certainly lead on the whole conversation around the transition to sustainable capitalism, because it has the time, the resource, and probably the orientation. The history in Asia, the broader mindset, is much more consistent with a more sustainable way of thinking about finance and a sustainable way of thinking about economies. When we talk about the role of private sector, we don't exclude the importance of civil society and government. There's no question that civil society and government will need to be part of this conversation, and indeed will be an integral part of the conversation. But ultimately, it's business, and by extension capital markets, that will be the driving force, because indeed that's where the source of capital is, and that's where the source of innovation can be as well. And so taking the issues that civil society and government sees, and then mobilizing capital to address these challenges, that will be done through business and capital markets. And so in reality, it's really where the capital flows are that will drive these changes, but it needs to be a three-way conversation. It needs to be business, civil society, and government.
Well, I think many Asian businesses are already providing leadership. There is, after all, a great deal of public support for reductions in pollution. To take one example, that's true in China, it's true in Hong Kong. And those businesses that are part of the solution often are rewarded with extra brand value, with more customers and market share. They often find it easier to recruit the brightest college graduates to come and join their workforce. They have less turnover. And many of them are finding that when they adopt this new approach, they not only reduce pollution, they reduce the cost of energy that they're paying. They reduce their budgets for natural resources because they're turning more of them into products instead of turning part of them into these waste streams that pollute the air and water. So the cost savings and the extra value they're earning, these are among the incentives that are causing many Asian businesses to move in this direction. If more do so, as Asia becomes a more powerful source of influence in the global economy, that can help bring about these changes globally.
And the other important point to note is what we're talking about is actually good economics. It's good long-term business. And that is actually why Asian companies will be leaders in this transition. It will be to drive revenues, profitability, and competitive positioning. What we've always been talking about is what makes sense for business, what makes sense for good long-term economic growth, and by extension, what makes sense for the planet and people.
Well, I think change is always difficult, and when people have done the same things the same ways for a long time, it's just human nature to resist change. It's often inconvenient. Now, there are some who have a vested interest in not having any price put on the pollution that they're responsible for. So naturally, they're going to resist it. But these are obstacles that can be overcome. It will take time, and even though change sometimes seems to be difficult, once it starts, it gains its own momentum, and before you know it, we're shifting over into the new and better way of doing things.
The honest answer is I think we are very optimistic. We're optimistic because we're generally optimistic people. We're optimistic because it actually makes sense. We have to fundamentally convince people that what we're talking about is not trading values for value, but in fact a more sensible long-term way to run economies and business. And as people understand that, the acceleration, I think, will increase. We already have $30 trillion of people, businesses or investors and asset owners who've committed to sustainable capitalism. That's not a bad start. We will accelerate that as people recognize that this is about sensible business, sensible economics. And I think the last reason is, frankly, we have no choice. We have to accelerate to a sustainable capitalism because the resource constraints that we face, the challenges around climate, the challenges around sustainable development, poverty, health, water, these challenges will not wait for a generation. They must be addressed now.
I'm also optimistic for the same reasons, particularly the last reason David cited. We have no choice. We as human beings generally do the right thing, in Churchill's words, after first exhausting every available alternative. And I think we've just about arrived at that point.